In the summer of 1950, when the Korean Peninsula exploded into one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War, few expected that a small archipelago in Southeast Asia would become one of the earliest and most committed nations to answer the call. Yet the Philippines, barely 5 years removed from the devastation of World War II, would soon send thousands of soldiers to fight in a war thousands of miles away. Their involvement would become one of the most extraordinary and overlooked chapters in Asian military history. But to understand why the Philippines fought in the Korean War, we must go back decades earlier, to the time when the country's identity, military structure, and political alliances were first shaped. And we begin not in Korea, but in the chaos of the early 20th century. The Philippines did not participate in World War I directly, but the ripples of that conflict reached its shores. During that era, the archipelago was under American rule, and Washington began modernizing the Philippine Army, establishing military academies, training grounds, and reserve units. Filipino troops trained under U.S. officers, laying the foundation for a force that would later face one of the most brutal battles of World War II. By the 1940s, war had arrived at the Philippines' doorstep. When Japan launched its invasion in December 1941, the Philippine Army, combined with U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur, fought desperately across Luzon and Bataan. These were soldiers who often lacked equipment, ammunition, and proper supplies. Many were young, untested, and unprepared for the harshness of modern mechanized war. Yet their courage in battles like Bataan and Corregidor became legendary. Though the campaign ended in surrender, the resistance continued in the form of guerrilla fighters, and by 1945, Filipino and American forces liberated the islands together. When the war ended, the Philippines lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, infrastructure destroyed, and the economy broken. Yet despite these immense challenges, the Philippine Army rebuilt rapidly with American assistance. New training programs, new equipment, and new doctrine were introduced. The country's leadership believed that if the Philippines were ever to stand strong, it needed a disciplined, professional military, not merely for national defense, but to show the world that the Philippines was ready to take its place as a responsible and capable nation in international affairs. By 1950, this transformation had begun. The Philippines had just regained full independence 4 years earlier, and its leaders wanted the world to see the country as a new democracy committed to global peace and security. So when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea in June 1950, the Philippines faced a historic decision. The United Nations urgently called for help. Many nations hesitated. The Philippines did not. President Elpidio Quirino announced that the Philippines would send troops, not merely symbolic support, but a full military contingent. It would be the first Asian country to join the UN force, and the third nation in the world to send combat troops to Korea. These soldiers would be known as the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea, better known as PEFTOK. Their mission was simple: defend South Korea from collapse, stand alongside the UN coalition, and prove that the Philippines, though still recovering from war, would not turn away from a friend in need. The 1st Battalion deployed in late September 1950. They were a mix of veterans who had fought against the Japanese and young recruits who had never seen battle. They carried American rifles, wore American-style gear, and trained under American doctrine, but they marched under the Philippine flag. When they arrived at Busan, the port was still flooded with refugees. Families who had fled burned villages, crying children, men carrying whatever they could salvage on their backs. The smell of smoke and fear hung over the harbor. It was a sight none of the Filipino soldiers ever forgot. From the moment they landed, PEFTOK earned a reputation for discipline and fearlessness. Their first major operation was the Battle of Mudong, where Filipino troops captured strategic hills against stiff resistance. But it was in the Battle of Yultong where the legend of the Filipino soldier would be etched into Korean War history forever. It was April 1951. Over 40,000 Chinese troops launched a massive offensive to break UN lines. The Filipino 10th Battalion found itself directly in the path of this overwhelming force. The numbers were impossible. one small battalion facing an entire Chinese division. Night fell, and the hills erupted with muzzle flashes and artillery fire. Yet the Filipinos held their ground. They refused to retreat. At one point, communication lines were cut and ammunition was running low, but they fought with such intensity that Chinese forces later described them as the battalion that would not die. By morning, the line held, and the UN front remained unbroken. Yultong became a symbol of Filipino courage, discipline, and resilience. But the Korean War was not only defined by dramatic battles. Much of the Filipino experience was a test of endurance. Long nights in freezing trenches, endless patrols across mountains and rice paddies, sudden ambushes, fields littered with mines, snowstorms that cut visibility to zero. For soldiers who came from a tropical country, the Korean winter felt like punishment from nature itself. Some Filipino troops said the cold was their greatest enemy, colder than anything they had ever imagined, biting through their coats, boots, and skin. Yet they adapted, they improvised, and still they fought. As additional battalions rotated into Korea, 5 in total, their contributions grew. They guarded key supply lines. They reinforced crucial positions. They helped recapture towns and villages destroyed by war. They provided humanitarian aid to civilians, handing out food, medical supplies, and blankets to families caught in the chaos. Korean children would run to the Filipino troops, calling them brothers from another land. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We did not just fight a war here, we became part of their story." Throughout 1950 to 1953, roughly 7,500 Filipino soldiers served in Korea. Many returned home as heroes. Some never came home at all. Their sacrifice created a bond between the Philippines and South Korea that still exists today. The Korean government built memorials honoring Filipino troops. South Korean presidents have repeatedly said that their nation would not exist today without the help of countries like the Philippines. And every year, Koreans visit Manila to honor those who fought for their freedom. The impact of the Korean War on the Philippines was deeper than most realize. It showcased the Filipino soldier to the world, disciplined, brave, reliable, and committed. It strengthened the alliance between the Philippines and the United States, and it positioned the Philippines as a responsible member of the global community willing to stand up for democracy, even far beyond its borders. Decades later, the story of PEFTOK remains one of the most incredible chapters of Philippine military history. A young nation, still healing from its own traumatic war, chose to fight again. Not for conquest, not for territory, but for principle, for belief, for the idea that freedom, once earned through great suffering, must also be defended wherever it is threatened. As we look back on the Korean War today, the Philippines' role reminds us that bravery does not depend on size, wealth, or power. It depends on spirit. And the Filipino spirit, forged in occupation, strengthened in liberation, and proven in Korea, showed the world that even a small country can shape the course of history.